Okay, so it's time to learn about another type of loop in JavaScript called the for loop. So the for loop is similar to the while loop in that they both let us repeat code. They're a little bit different in their syntax. So our objectives here, we want to understand the purpose of for loops, why you use one versus a while loop. We want to write valid for loops, and then compare and contrast while loops and for loops. So to start, here's a recipe for a for loop. We write the word for, it's a keyword, and then in parentheses, there are 3 parts. And so I've summed them up as the initialize, the condition, and the step. So this will take a little bit to sink in, and we'll clarify this over the next few slides. But the key takeaway here is that we write the word for, we have parentheses, 3 different things go in the parentheses, and then we have our curly braces. So here's an example. This is how you print the numbers from 1 to 5 with a for loop. So we start with for, and then we create a variable, I'm calling it count, and set it equal to be 0 in this first chunk. Then we have our condition, while count is less than 6, and then we have our increment, which is going to add 1 to count. So this is conceptually very similar to the while loops we've been writing. So you can see the equivalent while loop down here. The big difference is that this is just shorter, and the other difference is that this variable count only exists inside the loop. So this variable for a while loop must be initialized outside so that we can use it here. In a for loop, we can make a variable that exists only for a moment inside of this loop. So to go over this one more time, we're making a variable called count, and it starts at 0. Every time through the loop, we add 1 to count, and we keep going while count is less than 6. So the first time we run this, count is 0, we print it out. The next time, we've added 1, it's still less than 6, so then we print it out, and we keep going until count is 6. It's no longer less than 6, and the code stops running. So I'm going to copy this to my console and just demonstrate that. I paste that in, and we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here's another example, taking what we did with the while loop, where we printed every character in a string, but doing it with a for loop. So once again, you can see we don't have to create this count variable outside of a loop like we do for the while loop. We can create a temporary variable, and I used one called I. The reason I did that is that it's pretty conventional to see for loop variables be very short single letter variable names like I or J or K. And that's because they don't exist for any other purpose but to live inside the loop. So some people would argue it's better to keep them short. So over here I used count. You can name these whatever you want, but you'll see I a lot more often in the real world. So we make a variable I equal to 0. Every time through the loop, we're going to add 1. And we're going to keep going while I is less than the length of the string. So the logic is the same as what we're doing here. Make a variable called count, set it to 0, add 1 every time through, and keep going while count is less than the length. So when I run this, I'll copy it, open up the console, paste that in, and we get HELLO. And it prints one L with a 2 next to it. That's just how Chrome does repeated console.logs. So to sum this up one more time, inside of a for loop there are 3 parts. There's the initialize, where we declare a variable and set it to some initial value. It does not have to be 0. Then the next part, we have our condition, which is when this loop should keep running. And then the last part is our step. So what do we do at the end of every iteration? Do we add 1 to count or to I? Do we subtract 1? Do we multiply it? There's all sorts of different things. Most often though, you'll see it with I++, just like we did with while loops.